If you have found your way to this video, then the chances are you've seen other gun tubers do stuff like this, and this, probably even this.
Look what I found!
And while I am way too poor to do that kind of stuff with my firearms, I am autistic enough to be able to have a conversation with you guys about the physical constraints and properties that are actually gonna wear and tear and wind up breaking your barrels. If that sounds like something you're interested, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, check out the channel. I'm Jessie, this is Boondock Ballistician. And I wanted to talk with you guys today about the actual firing effects and the wear and tear that just general usage might have on your firearms. Wear and tear on your guns are normal, right? We expect within X amount of shots to have to make certain replacements, general cleaning procedures, all of that good stuff. But it is still something that we want to be aware of and that designers will try to quantify and take steps to mitigate those types of actions. We know events like high rates of fire, gas pressures, recoils, heat in certain areas that can cause deterioration of the internals, specifically the barrels. All things like that will wind up having a negative impact on your firearm. Some of these areas wind up being more predictable and manageable than others. For example, like the mechanical loading, the physical stressors, gas pressure from specific propellants, all of that is super understood and can be accounted for with pretty reasonable confidence. Obviously, there's variation depending on what you're shooting, right? Like a designer can't predict every single manufacturer, every single round that someone's going to put through their firearms, but you understand within a certain limitation, within a certain family, that these are the likely results. Other events, on the other hand, though, are far less predictable and make that job a lot more tricky. So obviously, if we're talking about barrel wear, the projectile itself is going to be the main driver of impact here. And while mechanical loading of the bullet as it's going down the barrel is predictable, the rotating band pressure that's caused by the spinning of the bullet is actually the exception to this. We know the rotating bands act to help seal in those propellant gases and to impart rifling torque to the projectile. I say torque, torque. That's a hard one. So those bands get engraved into the rifling, and since it occurs through a swaging type process, there's an understandable amount of resistance that we can see, which we're going to wind up seeing in the form of radial forces. Swaging, if you guys don't know, is a manufacturing process usually referred to, but in this event, it is the act of changing the shape of a given material through sets of molds and dies and things like that. So the barrel is actually molding the projectile as it comes down, similar to the swaging process. So when that force is distributed evenly around the band surface, that's when we see the rotating band pressure. And since more material is going to wind up being displaced on the lands, that pressure is going to be higher on the rifling lands than on the bottom of the grooves. So you can see how that makes a very uneven system. A lot of words there, might not mean much, but what I'm trying to get out there is when the band pressure is high enough or frequent enough, it'll cause damage to the barrel. And like I mentioned before, this one isn't really great at being predictable. It does make it tricky to compensate for because it's not as predictable. What we do know is that the peak of these pressures are going to be at the origin of the rifling, which makes sense, right? These bands are going to be worn down as they travel along the bore, but also since oftentimes the barrel does get thinner as you move down, there's less resistance to that dilation event, right? Less resistance to the dilation that's occurring. Obviously less wear and tear, it's less harsh of a system. The conversation of energetics, and this is explosives, propellants, energetics, right? They become tricky in the sense that the events are so sudden and usually extreme that quantifying them is very different than any other stress strain event. If any of you guys are mechanical engineers, materials engineers watching this, and you've done any modeling and simulation or anything like that, you might be familiar with that. But if you try to quantify these energetic moments, they're a completely different ballgame than what you would see with standard materials undergoing consistent stresses, because that impact is so fast, so quick, and so much energy in one foul swoop. It doesn't behave the same way you would expect as if it were even, ongoing, and you do wind up having a whole different set of equations and behaviors that these events will mimic. In a firing event, the pressure is going to be very short-lived in a very local area, which comes and goes so fast. So the damage being done isn't going to be obvious up front. We know our guns last hopefully a good bit of rounds. This is not a, overnight process unless you're loading yourself and loaded bad. You really shouldn't see these things in a short period of time, or if you're buying guns from certain manufacturers, perhaps. You guys can argue in the comments below who you think I'm talking about. Take a stab. I won't confirm or deny. But after enough rounds, you start to see the cracks and the damage, and eventually you get bore rupture. Since the band pressure is what's going to wind up flattening your rifling lands, it is pretty important to try and optimize that rifling depth. And that is also why fouling shots are a thing. Aside from just the expected wear and tear from the rough firing process, the projectile engraving process, all of that, another area of consideration, though to a lesser extent, is going to be just the recoil forces and vibrations that are created in this whole system. Recoil forces are actually pretty incidental in barrel design. In your single recoil systems, any recoil effects aren't going to exceed those axial stresses caused by gas pressure. And in your double recoil systems, those secondary recoil stresses will bend the barrel, but since that second recoil event occurs after the projectile exits, the stresses of this and the gases aren't going to compound, which, good thing, that would be a terrible, terrible event. Definitely would wear and tear fast. If you're not familiar, when I say single and double, I refer to one spring systems or two spring systems with varying strengths. So a double recoil system would be your nested systems. That lack of the compounding event does allow the impacts of the secondary recoil to not be considered critical. Recoil isn't that big of a deal. Vibrations, on the other hand, might be a bit more of a conversation. Surprisingly, vibrations are actually considered more in the conversation of accuracy than recoil is, which is interesting, but believe me on that. Not only do they pose concerns in regards to accuracy, but they actually do pose a pretty decent concern in terms of structural integrity. We see these types of concerns happen because of the propellant and band pressure, balloting, which is a really dumb way of saying the lateral disturbances as the projectile travels down the barrel. I don't know who makes these words. And barrel width is something that's obviously another additional concern. So it is much easier to ignore vibrational effects on heavier barrels, slower firing weapons, since the vibrations are going to be able to be dampened before the next shot occurs. But in high rates of fire systems, that's a completely different story. The vibration doesn't have that time to dampen out, which means it's allowed to create kind of this resonation influence, which can actually lead to a failure. So for weapon designers, the barrel and whatever holds it in place have to be designed in a way that they will dampen these vibrations. But since weight considerations of firearms, especially modern firearms, are a huge conversation, it becomes a tricky optimization problem. A lot of the design choices to adjust for weight and size type concerns wind up making the barrel more susceptible to some of those factors that would otherwise be considered benign. We have the trend now in modern firearm developments to want to go a lot lighter. It's understandable, especially with all of the additions of the peripheries that people are putting on, everything else. Kits get really heavy really fast, but there's only so much weight we can take off with modern manufacturing, modern materials engineering, that won't wind up completely negating in terms of performance. The last firing effect that I wanted to touch on, and this is my personal favorite, is the effects of heating and thermal stresses. We all know the barrel gets toasty roasty. I'm sure most of us have got hot hands before. I certainly have done it plenty of times. But all of the energy and the heat from firing, it's largely absorbed by the bore, right? This makes sense, we know this. Having a high steady rate of fire actually helps keep a even temperature gradient across the barrel and create a more gradual flow, which kind of works in our favor. It does allow the system, that interaction, to kind of behave more akin to an auto-fretage. It basically acts like a work hardening system, which can be beneficial. If you're familiar with mechanical engineering, materials engineering, you can overwork harden a system. There is a point that has diminishing returns. It obviously depends on the means in which you're work hardening. But for a small event in time, depending on your firing cadences and your whole shebang setup, it does work in your favor for a portion of time. So the stresses are obviously considerable. Those thermal stresses are considerable. But since the pressure stresses are able to compensate, it actually winds up confining them. They typically wind up being non-critical because of that. However, once that firing ceases and you no longer have that sustained temperature gradient, or if you start to see big fluctuations in those temperature gradients, the temperature does actually rapidly equalize and create a high temp level for the whole bore. And that's when you start to see a negative impact on the material, specifically in regards to the yield strength. The thermal stresses are another area that is well known, but not so well understood. We can have an educated conversation about it, but the specific mechanisms are a little dicey. When firing, it's observed that you see that stress confined to a thin layer of the barrel at the bore surface, which in turn causes those thermal cracks. The best two theories for this as it currently stands are one, mechanical option, and two, a metallurgical explanation. While they do describe the same phenomenon, they kind of take it from a different perspective, allowing us to understand maybe perhaps different mechanisms. They are both based on the idea that the metal is contracting after cooling. And we know this, just depending on your engineering discipline, which one you care more about. I can geek out over this one, especially this is why it's my favorite, considering my materials background. So the metallurgical belief is my personal go-to. But basically, what that thought group proposes is that as the hot gases leave the bore, the cool metal adjacent to the bore and the air that's coming into the barrel after the projectile leaves cool the bore layer more quickly, right? So it'll actually cause the steel to phase shift, which that change can result in the transition from the austenite that you're typically seeing in your barrels to a martensite, which austenite actually has a larger crystalline structure. So the idea is when it cools, the shrinking of that structure causes the tensile strength to be exceeded, and bam, those cracks will form, right? So that's kind of the more materials explanation of that expanding and cooling. We know metal does this, that's well known, but that's the more technical explanation as to what's happening there. The mechanical explanation, which in my mind is way less cool, sorry mechanical engineers, but as you get that large temperature gradient, these guys think that'll create the compressive stress, which, okay, they don't think, it does, okay? But that temperature gradient will create the compressive stress on the bore surface. As that cools, these stresses are relieved and the material will try to go back to its original position, but it can't quite get there. Since it can't quite make its way back home, that material is displaced, and every shot afterward is going to create more and more and more stress until that tensile strength is exceeded, and then you see those cracks. I am sure both of these events are occurring. I am sure there is a lot of impact that the mechanical and material phenomenal explanations have on one another, but they are regarded as kind of two separate groups, two separate thought processes. And if you're looking to kind of work around this event, this occurrence, you're probably going to look specifically from one of those perspectives. And of course, plenty of other areas can impact the bore. We know rain and other weather events and corrosion, erosion, cook-off events, all of that good stuff is going to cause wear and tear. But I thought the ones that I had mentioned here were the best areas to cover since there are a little bit more nuances to them, right? Those more physical events like weather, basic erosion from propellants, all of that, they're a lot more widely talked about. The ones I mentioned do have a little bit more nuance. I think erosion is something that doesn't need any explanation. It's cool though, right? There's fancy equations and smart people who can try and compensate for those effects. Modeling, mathematical simulations, equations, they're all very limited for energetics. We do the best we can and they've gotten better and better, but you're limited to a lot of assumptions when you're doing these kinds of analyses and trying to work with these kinds of factors. You have to subscribe to a certain physical constraint. So when you're going into it, you can pick best for your specific system, but that's not to say that modern modeling capabilities don't struggle. They're extremely hard on our computers. They take a while to run through and they are not without known flaws, but they're known flaws which allow us to kind of take a look at the data and adjust. If you guys are interested in this video, maybe I could do a follow-up on correctional concepts and measures. I don't know, let me know down below. I hope this was interesting for some of you guys. Maybe one day I will have the means to destroy my weapons, much more like Kentucky Ballistics and all of those other guys. But for now, you get the mathy, dorky outlook. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. The next video won't be as dorky, so see you guys later. Oh no. Let me see, I think that's a little rooted. We didn't like this tree anyway.